Congressman, good morning.
Good to see you, Steve. Thank you.
So we're talking about the future of retail today, and I know you have a wife, 2 kids, a grandson, so I just want to get this out of the way. Where do you shop?
Virtually any place where you need to buy stuff, but Cincinnati is the best shopping online.
Online, Cincinnati Street.
My
any
kids
favorites?
taught me how to do it online periodically, although, to be honest with you, my wife generally takes care of that stuff. But still generally going in a brick and mortar store in general. So
you're hedging for the purposes of today's conversation. A little bit online, a little bit in the shop.
Exactly,
okay, great.
that's right.
Well, let me ask you, as we're talking about this, and we're starting out with the public policy dimensions of this tension, and there is a tension growing out there. Is Amazon going to do everything, I suppose, at some point? And how do retailers in this world make it? Where we convert? What do you see as the market failures we should worry about? And I ask that because I'm wondering where the public policy concern is, if you have one, as in your role with small business.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly there's competition from the internet now, whether it's Amazon or all kinds of other sources, and as I say, the brick and mortar folks have to be concerned about that.
But does that translate into kind of a government concern? That's just competition, right?
Well, it is competition, and in general, I think the less government involvement in this whole thing, whether it's net neutrality or anything else, we want as little government involvement, government role as possible. The private sector is much more efficient. We ought to let market forces determine how these things work. It doesn't mean we're not anarchists. We don't think that there should be no regulations or no government involvement at all. But we don't want the heavy hand of government involved. And so I think let the private sector, let those market forces determine.
But as you look at this, one of the things that we talk a lot about is that, the president is going to Davos. It was interesting. And the president is going to meet a lot of business people. And the kind of new shtick of Davos is the fourth industrial revolution, which is automation, data, and a lot of this is perceived to be job displacing. So if you've got Main Street in Cincinnati and you've got constituents there, you've got Amazon online with data that knows what I want before I want it, are you worried about the jobs impact, the people impact, the town impact?
Well, I think we have to be, and in general, that's going to tend to be short-term. The job disruption over the long term will create more jobs overall by the healthy competition. And if you're using, you mentioned Cincinnati, that happens to be my district. I represent most of the city of Cincinnati and the surrounding area. And Macy's is headquartered in Cincinnati, and they just announced recently, within the last week or so, that they're closing down the downtown store. That was one of the 11 stores.
They're closing the downtown store where they're headquartered?
And they're headquartered in Cincinnati. So that shows you the displacement there is. And is there concern out there? Heck yes. I know this, having been a member of City Council for 5 years prior to coming to Congress, and having been a county commissioner for 5 years back there, I know that the local folks are very concerned about that, and rightfully so. Over the long term, things in general will continue to go in a positive direction, and there will be job creation. But there is disruption in the short term.
When I know that you've also been out there thinking a lot about innovation, and that we need more of it. We're not getting as much as we classically have had in the United States. What do you think we need to do on that front? Because that's innovation does lead to business, small business, driving jobs and whatnot.
Well, we have to encourage entrepreneurship. We have to encourage
but what
folks
does that mean?
investing.
Break that down.
Well, it means, for example, what it means at a governmental level, and that's where I'm at right now, obviously, is the recent tax bill, allowing people to keep more of their money. Now, there was a lot of propaganda about that leading up to this, and I think still is, that this was just tax cuts for the rich and middle-class folks, and nobody else benefited. I think they're seeing now that that's not true at all. Overwhelmingly, a lot of people are going to be able to keep more of their own money at all income levels. And a lot of folks are going to determine, because this is what they want to do, they're going to start up small businesses. That is the growth sector of the American economy nowadays. It's good old American entrepreneurship. It's people starting their own businesses. And in fact, the overwhelming number of new jobs created in America, about 70%, are created by small business folks, and a lot of those are startups and entrepreneurs.
I went last night and reread one of the Kaufman Foundation reports on entrepreneurship in America. It was co-written by Bob Lighton, who's been a real advocate and started the startup bill on how to be more friendly to startups, what tax measures needed to be taken. But the biggest thing they said America was not getting right was on immigration, that an overwhelming number of startups and innovation and entrepreneurship come from new immigrants to the United States. How do you square that with where both your party and kind of the government is right now, which is such a hot potato, but when you look at the data just very clearly shows that new people that come into this country overwhelmingly drive innovation.
Yeah, and that's where, again, politics gets into it, because most of folks, whether they're Democrats or Republicans in Congress, are for immigration, the legal immigration, and that's where the difference is. I'm a Republican, and our party thinks that folks ought to come here legally. We ought not to allow folks to cut in line of folks that are waiting in line to do that, to come here legally, and that's the issue. And of course, I know probably most of the folks here have been following the news, and there was a big meeting at the White House just recently, and they're talking about DACA and so-called comprehensive immigration reform and a whole range of things. So I think ultimately, we'll resolve this issue, but DACA, for example, which is folks that came here, their parents brought them here, some of them were old enough to maybe know what was going on, a lot not. But that needs to be resolved along with more border security.
How would you resolve it?
Along with border security, and that's what they're talking about. Now, whether you call it a wall or whether you call it a fence or a barrier and partly wall, I think most people agree that not the entire thing needs to be a 30-foot wall. And I was actually down there about a month ago and seeing the various companies who are competing for building this wall. We want to do it as efficiently and economically as possible. But we have a right as a sovereign nation to determine who comes here and what skills they're bringing to our country and whether they're going to be a burden on American citizens or not. And that's something that we're still going through right now. Unfortunately, I think some folks, rather than resolve the issue, want the issue so that they can beat up on the other party in the next election. And we're in Washington here today. Unfortunately, that's too much a part of what goes on in this city.
Congressman, has the wall become, I try to sit through these discussions on the wall, and I get what the wall metaphorically means, which is border security, which can mean a lot of other kinds of questions, even of students who come and overstay their visas, of people who come into the United States, and we've had challenges with that. But this notion of just massive penetration of our borders from the south, when you look at the data today, that's not happening. You also have the problem, what's interesting is that Mexico is growing old, and it's having, just because of its own demographic shifts, a lot less of its young people leaving. And so I'm just interested in whether the wall has become a kind of political element that's not actually connected to the real people flow that seems to be causing some of the concern.
Yeah, well, it's ebbed and flowed as far as folks coming into the country. And there are statistics out there that you can argue virtually both sides on almost every issue, and this issue is one of those. And I think the bottom line is we want to have security at the border. We want to know who's coming in the country. Nowadays we have an international threat from terrorist organizations that would like to do harm here, just as they're doing in Europe and other places now. So
what?
Back to retail.
We'll get there. I find that the interesting question, though, in terms of job displacement and how people are looked at in innovation, is very much a part of this question as well. So, as you look at your colleagues in Congress, do you find that they have a kind of literacy about where the future of retail is going and what the social impacts will be?
Well, some do, and others may not. But I think we all would agree that the retail industry in this country is where a lot of the future jobs are going to be. And some of those are in traditional type retail establishments, others more online and virtual now. And the important thing is, and I think the bottom line is, we need to make sure that whatever we do in this city here in Washington is conducive to improving that, and not that we're a roadblock or that we're doing something to artificially stop something that will naturally happen out there and create the jobs of the future.
How secure do you think we all are in the online space? One of the things that had come up with regards, we were discussing yesterday about Alexa and Amazon and data, and whether or not in both our own privacy worlds, but also with cyber theft, cyber sabotage, whether or not this arena is getting the kind of attention that it needs in terms of the retail space, because that space is basically one where trust is there. We're talking a lot about the connectivity, you know, way people make transactions as being trust, but this is a new area where there's not a lot of trust, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, cybersecurity is one of the issues that, whether it's the Homeland Security Committee or the Small Business Committee that I happen to chair, we've had quite a few hearings on this. We've brought in experts, we've brought in people that have been directly affected by this. You know, one of the unknown facts out there is that small businesses are particularly vulnerable in the cybersecurity area because if they are attacked, it's a pretty significant percentage of those within 6 months that unfortunately go under. The average hit is about $32,000, which to Procter & Gamble or GE Aviation or Kroger's, all entities that are headquartered in my district, they can handle that quite easily. But if you're a small mom and pop outfit, that can be devastating. We had a fellow in from Maine who was a small business owner that was on his way into work and went online and discovered that his bank account was zero. And that was payroll day. He was supposed to pay his dozen or so employees, and he didn't know what he was going to do. And so it can be a life or death thing. So what we're doing now is, through the Small Business Administration, we're working with what are called Small Business Development Centers. There's about 1,000 of them all around the country. And we're having them work more now to have assistance to small business folks who are concerned about best practices, finding out the best way to protect themselves from cyber attacks. And those cyber attacks are coming from criminal organizations, domestic here in the United States, but they're also coming from Russia and China and Iran, North Korea. And as I say, to a small business, they can be devastating. So it's something that we have to educate ourselves on. You know, is the internet safe? Should people shop there? Absolutely. But it's not completely safe, and we have to do better.
We have a whole string of companies that are going to be represented here today. Urban Stems, Bonobos, others that have come up, and they have found, you know, massive markets available to them, I think, in the online space. And some of them started out very small in their regions. And I was interested in your Twitter feed. You were highlighting some of these SBA credits and SBA loans. I guess they're SBA 7 or Section 7.
Yeah.
What do you think those are fixing that needed to be fixed?
Well, we have a lot of personal information the government gets. If you're getting the 7A loan is the kind of premier loan within the SBA loan system. Right. And there are 8A loans more for minority companies, and you've got microloans and a whole range of them, but the 7A is a principal one, about $24 billion a year. And small business loans, they're not government money going out in loans. The government basically backs private sector loans that are going through banks. So
they're risk guarantees?
Yes,
basically.
That's right. They're risk guarantees. That's exactly right. And we have a lot of personal information from folks. And so the government and individuals have to protect themselves from being attacked. We have a responsibility to. I mean, we've seen the Defense Department. We've seen the Postal Service. We've seen the White House successfully hacked. And with all the protection that you would think the federal government has, how is the small business person out there going to protect himself or herself? It's a challenge. And so they have that responsibility as well when you have personal information from folks and Social Security numbers or home addresses or a whole range of things to protect that information, or they may be liable themselves. And so it's a big problem, and we need to make sure that we solve it.
When Macy's comes to you and said, you know, I don't know if they have come to you, and I did watch the day they announced their results, and they had huge sales increases, but their stock took a dive. This was about a week ago, and it was because the future expectations of the pressures of online are going to put a lot of pressures on brick and mortar. When you sit there and they come to you and they're looking for help and assistance and guidance, we have a lot of people here today struggling with the same sort of question. What do you think? What is the answer in that? And I guess I'm sort of trying to struggle with the notion that bricks and mortar companies are still out there. They're still investing in that, as opposed to just acquiescing to the online side. But when Macy's comes to see you and said, hey, we need assistance, what are they asking for?
Yeah. Well, in general, if they're asking for assistance for the government to solve the problem, it's not there. We can help in the environment in which they operate. For example, going back to the tax cut recently, that's something the government can do to let people keep more of their own money. I mean, if you look at small business folks, in general, the tax rates went from, at the upper levels, about 40%, down to about 20%, and if you're a really small business person, 9%. That's a heck of a drop, you know, from 40 down to 9. And in the corporate world, it went down from, we had the highest corporate tax rates in the world, 35%. We used to be second after Japan, and then they lowered the rates, and then we were the top in the industrialized world. We went from 35 down to 21. We're still not the lowest, but we're at least competitive now. So what we can do really is to improve the economic environment, and that's, I think, what this tax bill will show. Over time, people are going to realize, I think, what an advantage this is, and also scaling back the regulations. The other thing the government does is make it difficult for a business to be successful out there and to be profitable, because we load you up with a lot of red tape and unnecessary government action.
Right. Let me stop there and let me open up to the floor and questions in the few minutes we have here. Questions in the back? You have a question? No. No question.
Okay, there you go.
I'm going to use the time then. Okay. Makers movements. Bob Goodlatte, your chairman of the Judiciary Committee, who's going to be retiring, has talked about, even in Congress, basically setting up days where makers come in and there's more. I try to give congressmen who are perhaps not as close to this a bigger chance when you talk about innovation and kind of the new kind of defragmentation, I guess, of you know, entrepreneurs out there making things. Have you been part of any of that?
Yeah, well, the HALOS bill would be an example where we essentially are saying that, for example, at community colleges or other places where people are coming together, investors and people that have good ideas, that you not have to bring in every single financial document that you've ever generated in your career, and let people do it more common sense, and have investors and people that have the next great idea, or a whole bunch of people have really good ideas, to come together and not have the government be so involved in it and dictate to you exactly how you have to prepare to come there and what paperwork you need and everything else.
But in terms of like people into 3D printing, or people into kind of new crafts and opportunities, or people that have figured out ways to use data in health and kind of bring this dimension, are members of Congress kind of exposed to that kind of diversity of explosive innovation sometimes? Well,
certainly to some degree, and it depends on, when you say members of Congress, it depends on what committee you generate your time on. Just to give you an example, I'm, as I mentioned,
you're in
chairman of small business, but I'm also on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm on the Judiciary Committee. So you have a tendency to have an expertise in those different areas. So it all depends on you know, I can't speak for every member of Congress, because you may be on the Agriculture Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, and that's where you devote most of your time, or veterans or other things.
And I guess the last thing I'm really interested in, you know, again, in terms of taking a look at the ecosystem for business and retail and what's happening in the world, is the difference between dense urban cities, which Richard Florida says are going to get denser. They're going to create, you know, opportunities for more of the creatives coming in and rewiring and changing the way in which we all interact and sort of look at cities, versus sort of the heartland, if you will, or the non-urban areas. And I'm wondering, you know, Richard Florida would say that divide is getting wider, and that the opportunities for you. I just talked to a major auto company, I won't major which, that says they're kind of moving away from, isn't innovation great? They're not saying it's not going to happen, that AI and driverless cars aren't coming, but that we need to figure out what this other world is and what the opportunity is there, and so that we don't actually aggravate that divide, aggravate opportunity. As we think about retail and what, you know, when we look at the, you know, the old kind of almost cliched discussion of the Walmarts versus the small shops. Now we're talking about online versus them. What do you, I mean, do you think a little bit about what we need to do for the areas outside of Cincinnati, for instance, and how we kind of bridge that divide as opposed to let it get wider?
Well, certainly, and that has a bit to do with the infrastructure, whether you're dealing with the infrastructure, literally bridges and roads and things, or whether we're dealing with things like net neutrality and how you communicate now in the world that we live in.
And you're really anti-net neutrality?
I think that we ought to have as little government involvement as possible. I'm more like Thomas Jefferson. I think he was right on a lot of things. He happened to go to the same college I did, William and Mary, too. So.
and we're right at the end, so I can't take the net neutrality thing longer. But it's intriguing. Thank you very much, Steve Chabot, for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thank you. Thank you.